in our last example, we really went through the entire checklist. We did the data layer where we get the data, we set the data, process the data, we viewed the layer and went through the React lifecycle hooks. We drew the chart, style the component, and we even done handle user gesture and some transition when the user resize the chart. So when we build our chart, we're able to really see the historical price of a stock over time and with the price, and we're able to make changes to the metric. So we can change, for example, the price to other one easily. We have the widget structure. The piece we're really missing in this whole thing, if you look at the checklist, is really more with the transition. How do we handle animation? So for example, if we want to take the chart that we build and create an animation over time, so for example, where you're going to use that, if you've seen those financial website that shows you the change over time in a live mode of a stock or anything like that, then we need to handle animation. How would we handle the animation with React and D3? So in this section, I'm going to show you how we can take the line chart that we built before and in the previous lesson, and then we can take it and really start handling more complex transition. What I've done is I took the last example we created, the line chart, and I created a new folder called line chart transition, and I did the line chart transition widget. And what I've done is I just copied the same file and I renamed the function component from line chart to line chart transition. You can see here, so we have line chart transition. So it's just a copy of line chart. I just changed the function name, and I changed the line chart transition helper to, the line chart to line chart transition helper. So it's the same file as the helper in line chart. I just changed the name. The reason I've done that is so you can see how we take it from where it is now to adding the transition, and the same with the widget. So everything is the same, and if I build and look at localhost, you can see this is exactly where we stopped last time. Now we can start from the widget. What we need to do in the widget is few things. We need to create an interval that can refresh the data. Now working with intervals in React, I don't know if you've done this before, but it's a little tricky and complex, and that's because React handled the DOM, and we kind of need to handle it in a way that React will understand what we're doing without creating any side effects. So the first step is really to create that interval, so every second the data would change. So to do that, what we can do is we can go and create a new use effect, and inside of that use effect we'll put that interval. So our use effect here's a new use effect, and what we can do is we need to create an interval variable that I'm going to be using the use interval from JavaScript, and inside of it we'll put an inline method that will handle what we want to do. And then after we set our interval, we need to set how many seconds, or it's in millisecond, how many milliseconds it's going to take before we're going to call it again. So I can set it to 2000 milliseconds, which is going to be 2 seconds. It's good enough so we can see the change. And then this is the tricky part with React, is we need to, on the return, we need to every time clear the interval. And if we're not going to do that, what's going to happen, it's going to keep running the interval all the time, not at the time that we set. So we need to handle it that way. It's a little tricky in React, but once you get the hang of it, it's you become used to that. Then what we want to do is we want to, inside of our interval, we need to do a few things. We need to increase the second, so we need to keep track of how many seconds and set it. This way we can call it every certain amounts of second, and we can put it in the dependency. So the way we're going to do it is we need to create a state for our second. So we can do it up here. We can just create a constant and call it seconds and set seconds, so we can set it, and that's going to equal use state, and we're going to start from 0. So now that we have the seconds, we can edit into our use effect. In our use effect, every time the interval is getting called, we're going to increase the second in 1. So our new seconds is going to equal seconds plus 1, and then we can set the new seconds with our new constant. Okay. Now in terms of the data set, we need to, basically what we're going to do is we're going to remove one point, and then we're going to add a new point. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new data set, and that's going to equal our entire data set minus 1 point, and then we'll add 1 point. So that's what it's going to look like. I'm using the spread operator, so we get the entire data size, and then I'm slicing the last point, and then here we need to generate new point. So I can write all the code here, but I like to split it up. So what I can do is I can create a memorized generate new data point function and pass the data and let that function handle that. Now watch that I'm using the memorize again with the use callback. The reason that I need to use the memorize generate the memorize callback is because I'm inside of use effect. If I don't do that, then our use effect won't know when to call it, and it's going to call it all the time. So you could see the dependency. We're going to need the data, we're going to need the seconds, and we're going to need that memorized data point. And now we can create that. We can put that, it needs to be created before use effect, so I can do it here above that. So I can create my memorize generate new data point and use the callback, and inside I can we're passing the data. So what we can do is we can call the data set, and our data set is going to be of the same type data, and it's an array of data. So we need to add that, and once we call that, we can create our function, and it also needs dependencies. You have to put the dependency even if it's empty. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our helper with our metrics to calculate things. So we need to initiate our helper. So we're going to use the line chart helper to create a new instance of our helper using, now here we need to create an instance of our metrics, we need the properties name. And if you remember, we have it in the line chart, we're passing those properties name. So I don't want to type it twice, so what I can do is I can actually create a properties names, and I can create another state for the properties names. So property names. Now the reason that I'm creating a state for that and not just creating a constant is because I'm using it inside of a use effect and use callback. And because I'm using it, we don't need the set, we only need the property names. And because we're doing it inside of a use callback, if it's a constant, it's gonna force our method to all the time check that there's no change, and that can really create a problem for us. So it's much better to set it either as a reference or set it as a use state. Now we need to do a little bit of cleanup because I'm using the line chart helper We need to use the line chart helper, the new one we created. So let's point that out. Still using the old one. So here it is. Let's clean that up. And that's going to create us a problem. We need to change all the chart helper to the line chart transition helper. Let's replace all of those. Okay, great. I still have 2 errors. Let's see what's happening. Here it is. It has to be new line chart transition helper, and we need to update the dependencies with the properties name. And the types of data. Okay, all the errors are gone. So now that we have that property name state, we can also use it here in our line chart transition. Okay, now that we have our helper ready for us, we can continue. What we need to do is we need to calculate the last data point. And to calculate the last, because what we need to do is we need to take the last data point and return a new data element that we're going to edit at the end of our chart. So our last data point is going to be our set, right? The last element on our data set. So data set length, and we have to do -1 because it starts from 0. And then to calculate the next day, what we need to do is we need to create an offset for the next day. So we need to take our last data point, figure out what was the day, and then create a new formatted day for the next day. So take a look how we can do it with D3. We can call d3.day method, and that has an offset, so we can offset it using our last data point as the data and add 1. So take a look. So we can use helper x accessor, which is our data, and then we use our last. It's actually date point, right? It's the last data point, which gives us the last date point, really. And we need to cast it as date because that's how D3 expects it. And then we need to add 1 because we want the next day. Next is, now that we have the next day, the only thing we have left to do with the day is we need to format it. So to format the new date, what we can do is we can use different libraries, but D3 actually has a time format, so we can use D3 time format and passing the next day, so it's going to give us a string. And what we can do is, if you remember at our helper, we already done a time parse, so we need to use the same structures, that specifiers, the time parse. Here's the specifier of year, month, day, and that's going to give us a new date. And then we can return that as our new date, right? So what we can do is we can actually call date. So when we pass it, you can just do like that. With the, because it's the same one, the date match. And then for the value, what we need to do, we need to figure out the value. For the value, what we can do, we can use our helper with the y accessor, and then we can take our last data point. So that will give us the point of the screen, on the screen of the last data point. And then what I'm going to do, instead of bringing more data, we can just add a random number at the end. So this way we want to see a change. So I can use math random and multiply it by 6 and reduce 3. That's going to give me positive and negative value that I can add to my method, and that way we can see new result. And the only other thing is we want to make sure that it's going to be of type number. So when we call the accessor, our new point parse float, we can just make sure that it's coming as a number, and then we add that offset, just so we can see something on the screen without pulling new data. Okay, but in real life example, you may be just hooking up to a new you can hook up to some kind of service that brings you the current data on that specific date. So it could be, for example, if you're looking at a ticker, it could be a change in every minute. It could be many different things. Okay, so that's ready. So our memorized data point is set, and then when we go back to our use effect, now that we have a new data set, the only thing left to do is to set it as a new data. So if we set it as the new data, a new data set, what's going to happen is it's going to update our chart automatically, and it's going to bind to our line chart transition data element, and it's going to pass the new result. So every 1 second we're going to see new results. I'm sorry, every 2 seconds. I said it every 2 seconds to bring new result. Now, if we go to localhost and refresh, you could already see that it's working. Take a look. See? So at the end of our chart, you can see new results are kicking in, and at the beginning of the chart, some results start to disappear. So it is doing the transition, it's making the changes, but it's not very gracefully. The reason that it's not very gracefully is because we don't have full control of what's happening here. Our code, if you remember the line chart transition, what we did is we let JS6 handle the changes. So new data comes in, and everything get redrawn, and it's being done automatically using our memorized update callback. And you can see it here. Another thing that I want to show you is how we can take over the DOM from React. And you may not need it in this example because it's all working well, but there are scenarios that we need to take over from React the DOM if we want more control. So if we look at our component return rendering, it's using JS6, and we set everything, and it's binding to React. This is all great, but if we want to take over, this is what we're going to do. First, you need to delete the SVG tag, and we're just going to create the exact same thing using D3. So I'll show you how to do it. So what I did is I'm just leaving the div. Now we don't need the bracket. Okay. So, and now what we're going to do is we're going to put back those elements from the template that we had before and I deleted. If you remember, in the template we had two methods, one memorized draw callback and one was memorized update callback, and I'm going to put it back. So we need a few things. First of all, we need to create some kind of flag to know if our data was loaded, if it's the first time we're running it or not. So I'm going to use state, and when we first start, it's going to be false. Then we need a few more things. We need another state to kind of keep track of the previous height and set previous height. And the initial value, we're going to use the use state with initial value of the props dimension dot height, and the same for the width. So our previous width we're gonna use the, also we need the set previous width because we're gonna set it, and the dimension is gonna be for the width. Now that we have those flags set up, the flag and the previous one, we can take a stab again at the use effect. So in our use effect, we can check if our component was loaded. So if it was not loaded, we want to handle it in one way, and if it was loaded, we want to handle it differently. So if it was loaded already, we just want to call the memorize update callback. And if it was not loaded, we want to create another method to handle that and also call the update. Let's see. What we're going to do is we're going to create another use callback. You can put it here above the memorize update callback. And we can call it memorize draw because this is the first time we're going to draw. Let's close the tag, close the bracket, and then it always needs dependencies. And then we can use these methods in our use effect once we loading our component. We need to update the dependencies. See, so we adding the data, the loaded, the memorize callback, we're adding all of that. Now inside of our memorize callback, what we need to do is we need to create those static elements. So instead of having JSX draw them, which was really easy for us, what we need to do now, we need to let D3, I'm going to draw them using D3. The first thing that I want to do, I want to select all the div element. So I'm doing select div ID, and then if I do select all and I picked and I do star, it's going to select all the elements inside of my div, and I do remove because now I'm in charge of the DOM, so I want to be able to remove all the elements from the DOM. Then we need to create both the wrapper and we need to create the bounds. So our wrapper is going to be D3, D3 select, and we're going to select our div, and then we can append the SVG element just like we had it in JSX, and we also need to give it an attribute for the ID. Let's call it SVG, so it's matching and all of our code is going to work. And we append SVG. No, I'm sorry, I think we called it wrapper. You can check here. Okay. So if you look in our code, we called it wrapper. Actually, it looks like we're not using the wrapper. We just we're just using it to create our bound. So we really don't even need an ID. So all we need to do is we need to just create our SVG, and then what we need to do is we need to set an attribute for the width and an attribute for the height. So for the width, it's going to be dimension width, and we need an attribute for the height. Great. And now for the bounds, what we can do is we can use the wrapper we created, wrapper, and then append to a wrapper a G element and give it an attribute of bounds. You can see here in the memorize callback we're using that ID. So here it's really important we set our ID the way we had it before. It's going to need to update our dependencies. Then we need to do one more thing, is we need to, for our bounds, we need to style it, and we need to use the transform to move it the way we had it in JSX. If you remember, we had it moved to the margin left and margin right. So again, we'll use a translate. Inside of our translate, we're going to use the template and set it with the props dimension margin left, and we need to use the top. So we're moving it to the left top corner the way we had it before. That's for the bound. Then after we have the bound ready, we need to add the groups for our axis and the y-axis. So what we can do is we can use the bounds and append a path for our line and give it an attribute of path, ID path, so it matches what our memorize, update, callback expect. See, we have the path here, so now it's matching. Now I'm going to do something else. I'm also going to create an attribute for the class name, and let's call it a line. And what that can do is we can, in our Sass file, inside of our line chart transition Sass file, I can set a Sass with the fill, the stroke, and the stroked width. So let's go to right here, and this is really the preferred way to do it when we're using static values. So unlike the translate that we're kind of want to bind it to our props dimension property, in our static value that we're not binding it to anything, it's better to put it in a CSS file. It's just much better designed, because if someone that want to work on our code that is not familiar with D3, it's going to be easy for them. And we need to do again, we had it now for the line chart, and now we need to do the same for X's and Y. So we can append a group element and give it an attribute for the ID axis, so it matches what we have, and our update method can just pick it up, and the same for the y-axis. Okay, so now if everything went well, that should work. Let's take a look. If you go and you refresh, there you go. Looks like the y-axis is broken. Let's take a look. Okay, let's take a look. This happened to me so many times. When we set our transform for the bound, I forgot to put pixel. So this can drive you crazy if it happened. Now let's take a look. Here we go. So you see, now it works. Now if I resize my component, you see, resizing work. The resizing is working, but I want to show you one more thing. I want to show you, if we want to have more control over our component, we can actually, I set those state properties, and we can listen to those changes and handle it. And we don't need it in our case, but I just want to show you how it's going to look like. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to create another use effect function, and inside we're going to track changes to our width and height or any other properties we want. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to put a flag to check if we have a new height, and if we have a new height, then we can set our flag to true, and if we don't have, we can set our flag to false, and we'll do it using conditional arguments. So if the dimension of the height is a new height, it's going to set it as the new height, and we can do the same for the width. So if it's a new width, we're going to get the new value. Previous, I think I have a typo. Let's see. Yeah, we have 2D in the new width. So we need to set, let's fix that. It looks like the width, it got in with 2Ds. Okay, so now we have a flag to check if it's a new width and if it's a new height. Now, if it's a new width or a new height, we can do whatever we want with our component. So this way we have really full control over our component. In our case, what we want to do, if it's a new width and height, we want to remove what was there before and redraw everything. And we need to update our dependencies. And the last thing we need to do is, once there's a new values, we need to set our previous width and height. So we need to set our previous width and we need to set our previous height with the new values so it can compare the change. Because if we don't set the new values, every time the use effect is going to call and it has the old value, it's going to think there's a change. Now if I put a line breakpoint and I'm running it in debug mode, you can see what's happening. It needs to be called twice, okay? Now when I'm changing the width, you can see our method got called and it's showing me that, see, I didn't change the height, so the is new height equal false and is new height equal true, and now it's setting the new properties of the width and height. So every time I'm making a change, it's gonna be calling we're gonna get to this point here in our code, and we can make whatever changes we want on the screen. So for example, this is a good way, for example, if we want to handle breakpoint on different device sizes or anything fancy we want to do, we have full control over the component and what's happening and the changes that we make. So we have to add more codes to handle that and keep track with references of a new state, but it's worth it because now we have really full control over the DOM.